Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'm going to return to History of Political Philosophy, 3rd edition, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. We've looked at this book several times, and we'll continue to look at it essay by essay. Probably not going to look at every single essay in this book, but who knows? We'll find out. But for now, I'm going to keep coming back to it because there's a lot of good stuff in here. Today, we're going to go right back to the beginning, the first essay in this book. Thucydides. We talked about Thucydides last episode. Looked at some content around the Mytilean rebellion, and we got a bit of an oversight of Athens and Sparta and the differences between them and the sort of conflicts that were going on at the time of the Peloponnesian War. So today we can come back to Thucydides again and look in more detail at some of the other aspects of his writings, some of the other figures that we didn't get to last time. Today I want to discuss Alcibiades a little bit, and also Nicias, two Athenian generals who are discussed in the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. First, I want to read a section here when he talks about Thucydides' presentation style. He says, quote, "The speeches in Thucydides' book, with their moral seriousness and their urgency, call upon us to take sides, for or against them. And yet every reader must be struck by the contrast between the outspokenness of these speeches and Thucydides' own reticence. He does, to be sure, make some explicit judgments, but for the most part he does not tell us what he would have us think of the warring cities and their leaders, or of the many speeches and actions that he relates. Now this silence does not mean that he is indifferent, or that he no longer responds to men and events as he encourages us to do, with approval and disapproval. It shows, rather, that he is a skillful political educator. For the moral seriousness that he fosters in us remains immature. It does not sufficiently help us to promote the well-being of our communities, which it necessarily wants to promote, unless it is guided by, or culminates in, political wisdom. And since political wisdom is primarily good judgment about unprecedented particular situations, it is not so much a subject matter to be taught as a skill to be developed through practice. Accordingly, instead of telling us whether or not he approves of a given policy, Thucydides asks us to make our own judgments, and then to subject them to the testing that the war provides. He thus lets us hear speeches in the assemblies both for and against some course of action, and like the assemblymen, we must take our own stand one way or the other, without explicit guidance. Only subsequently, and in stages, as in political life itself, do we learn the aftermath of the actions that were in fact taken. And even then it is primarily up to us to weigh their true influence and to make the appropriate inferences as to their wisdom. To be sure, Thucydides' selection and ordering of narrative details, along with his explicit judgments, whose weight is all the greater for their rarity, help us to find our bearings in these reflections to such a degree, in fact, that his translator Hobbes could say that the narration itself doth secretly instruct the reader, and more effectually than can possibly be done by precept. But these helps become fruitful only when we accept the book's challenge to take positions of our own and to learn from our own mistakes. Indeed, an introductory statement such as this one would be worse than useless if it were to convey the impression of being a way to avoid this labor. Now it is true, as we have already noted, that Thucydides' reticence extends not merely to particular questions, such as those regarding policy, but also and especially to universal ones, and this despite the fact that the speakers in his book make many and contradictory claims about the most important of these matters. But here too we shall see. His reserve is not a sign of indifference, but rather an important element in his education of his readers. For mistaken positions, with regard to universal questions, can result in a pattern of erroneous particular judgments. And Thucydides' narrative helps his attentive readers to notice and thereby to overcome some of these deep-seated sources of error. In addition, the arguments themselves, by which the various speakers support their universal claims, often contain inconsistencies which reveal difficulties in the speaker's own positions. If we think through these difficulties, as our own concern with the matters at issue compels us to do, they point in the direction of a more adequate understanding. On occasion, Thucydides does indicate his own answers to these universal questions, in part by criticizing the mistaken views of some of the leaders in the war. But even in these cases where he explicitly guides our thinking, he first encourages us to take our own positions, which may well differ from his, and to approach his perspective through our own experience with the book. Moreover, his explicit judgments are always incomplete, and they raise further questions which we must answer on our own. End quote. So that's cool, the way Thucydides is writing a long time ago. This is quite ancient history. He's writing about the Peloponnesian War. He participated in the Peloponnesian War. Socrates participated in the Peloponnesian War. So that's the time frame that you're looking at. And he's a very sophisticated writer. And some of the speeches that I read aloud from last episode should indicate that he's a very skilled writer. But he doesn't always take sides. He just presents two competing speakers, each one who presents their own opinion. They make arguments, one for, one against. They make arguments against one another. He sort of steelmans both positions. He gives them a pretty good rhetorical skill to deliver their particular agendas. And then he sort of says to you as reader, make up your own mind as to what you would have done if you were sitting in the audience in the assembly that day. He tells you what they chose to do, and then he tells you how it turned out. But he's he takes a very light-handed approach when it comes to saying what the right course of action was or the wrong course of action. He just describes it. He says, here are the speeches, then here's what happened. And then here's what happened as a result of that, and then lets it unfold a little. And you don't always find out if it was a good choice or a bad choice until later on in the book when you start seeing the way things unfold and progress. Can you really begin to make judgments about the first speeches from the book? It's very interesting that way. But he says even in the speeches themselves, there are internal inconsistencies that you can uncover in one person's speech, and you might find that their position unravels a little bit on further analysis. So, or maybe those are just some of the unsolvable problems of life. Who knows how you want to take it. Anyway, let me move to the next section. He talks here about Athenian power, which was often regarded as one of the origin points of the Peloponnesian War was the growing power of Athens. So he says, quote, some Athenians who happened to be in Sparta on other public business, when they heard of the Corinthians and others' charges against Athens, asked for and received permission to address the assembly on their city's behalf. They spoke, not to defend themselves against the allies' charges, as if the Spartans were judges in a court of law, but to dissuade the Spartans from a hasty decision to go to war. The core of their argument, however, was the claim that they didn't deserve to be so hated for their empire, and that it was not unreasonable or perhaps not unfair for them to possess it. To support this claim, they argue that they were compelled to establish the empire and to expand it in the first place by fear and then also by honor and later also by benefit. Compulsions they later speak of together as the greatest things. But if actions done for the sake of honor and benefit, as well as those done from fear, can be regarded as compulsory and excused on that account, is there anything that is forbidden? In its way, then, the Athenians' defense of their empire is indeed no defense, since it attacks the very presupposition of all accusation, namely that there is voluntary wrongdoing. The Athenians add that they are not the first to yield to the temptation of empire, but that it has always been established for the weaker to be kept down by the stronger, and that no one with a chance to acquire something by force has ever yet been dissuaded by the argument from justice. These Athenians seem to have believed that the shocking bluntness of their argument would intimidate the Spartans, since only a powerful city would dare to say such things, and that since they would thereby deter Sparta from war. They do, however, go on to claim that they rule more justly than their power requires, or than others in their place would do. And they also warn the Spartans not to violate the truce between them, but to resolve their differences through arbitration. Now, as these concessions of sorts to justice may perhaps suggest, the Athenians were not so powerful as to force Sparta to tolerate their empire, and all that they were doing to increase it, through fear of that power alone. And yet they admitted openly that justice would never restrain them from seeking such power in the future. It is hardly surprising, then, that this speech failed to avert the war, for it reveals clearly what it was about Athens that so angered and frightened the Spartan alliance. End quote. So there's the description of the initial commentary, and I believe the Corinthians have something to say at that point as well, where they're talking to Sparta before the war has started, and they say, look, we acquired this. You can't blame us for doing what we did what had to be done. We acted out of necessity, first out of fear. They had just recently, the Persian War had recently been concluded, and the Persians were still a threat. And so the Athenians acted out of fear and out of desire for honor and out of desire for benefits that they gained from their empire, and that anyone else in their place would have done it. So they argue sort of out of necessity that they couldn't be faulted, and he says that they almost argued against the very nature of accusation, since they argued against any possible culpability for anything anybody does, because everything just happens out of necessity. Which interestingly brings us right back to episode 3, the naturalistic, deterministic dissolving of accusation, which doesn't really stand up, I don't think, to a detailed analysis of the implications of both determinism and accusation. But needless to say, this was not a successful argument. And he says they were not so powerful that they could force Sparta to tolerate their empire. Yet they do sort of make the argument that they'll do whatever they have to do to strengthen and expand their empire, and that they're not open to negotiation. They're not open to appeals to justice. They would only be open to some sort of intimidation. That's basically what the Athenians are saying. There's not much that you can do, Sparta or Corinth, to dissuade us from having a powerful empire. And so then the Spartans are clearly not dissuaded from war by the Athenians taking that attitude. Moving on from there, we come to a section where the author, who I should specify who actually is writing this essay, why don't I make that clear now? I probably should have mentioned that earlier. This is by David Bolotin. So anyhow, the author says here, when he discusses sort of who's to blame for the Peloponnesian War and why it started, he says, quote, "The more one reads Thucydides, the less one feels that Athens' suffering was fitting or deserved. And more generally, our first response to the book as a whole is not satisfaction at justice having been done, but is far more likely to be feeling of sadness. This sadness arises, in large measure at least, from a growing sense that the defeat of Athens is not the victory of justice, but that justice itself is among the chief victims of the war. Whether or not we are attentive to the fact that Athens' defeat came too late to serve the Melians and the other helpless victims of Athenian power, we cannot help noticing that the victorious Spartans became, if they had not always been, at least as oppressive as the Athenians. For instance, it was the Spartans and their allies who attacked Plataea, in spite of the oath they had sworn, in honor of Plataean heroism in the Persian War, to protect Plataea's independence, and although Plataea had been compelled to ally itself with Athens by Sparta's own indifference to the threat from nearby Thebes. And after besieging the city, the Spartans killed all the Plataeans who surrendered, not because they believed the savage accusations against them by the Thebans, but just about entirely, as Thucydides said, in order to gratify the Thebans, whom they regarded as beneficial to them in the present war. Later, in order to recover a mere 300 prisoners, including 100 or so from their first families, the Spartans agreed to the so-called Peace of Nicias, in which they betrayed, among many others, the cities that had relied on the generous promises of the Spartan leader Brasidas to revolt from Athens. And these are only two of the many examples that confirm what the Athenian ambassadors at Melos had said about the Spartans, that in their relations with others, they most transparently hold that whatever is advantageous is just, and that whatever is pleasant is noble. Yet it is not merely the Spartans and the Athenians whose behavior gives evidence of the weakness of justice in the war. To take only one telling example, in his extensive catalogue of the many cities and nations that fought against Sicily or for it, Thucydides says of all of them in general that they didn't take sides because of justice or kinship, so much as because of advantage, or else from compulsion. Men disregarded, moreover, the apparent restraining power of law or justice, even when such behavior served no interest of their own, except perhaps to satisfy an immediate passion. This we can at least understand during the plague at Athens, when the imminence of death freed men from all restraint coming from fear of gods or from any law of human beings, and people also thought it fitting to reap their profits quickly, and with a view to pleasure, since they regarded their lives and their property alike as ephemeral. It is harder to understand, however, the bloodthirsty Thracian mercenaries, who slaughtered on their way home from Athens the men, the women, the children, and even the beasts in the small town of Mycalessus. This was a calamity, Thucydides tells us, as worthy of being lamented, given its size, as anything that happened in the war. And most horrible of all, there is Thucydides' account of the civil war in Corcyra, and of the civil wars that subsequently convulsed all of Greece. The cause of these uprisings was the desire to rule, rooted in acquisitiveness and the love of honor. But after a time, the violence seemed to take on a life of its own. Revenge was in greater esteem than to have suffered oneself, and its scope was limited not by justice and the advantage of the city, but only by the immediate pleasure of whichever faction had the upper hand. The citizens who remained neutral, moreover, were killed by the partisans on both sides, whether because they didn't want to join with them, or else from their envy that they might survive. This saddening spectacle of the powerlessness of justice in the face of selfishness and violence is not merely a feature of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides shows, by his account of ancient times, both in Greece and in Sicily, and by his description of the emerging powers in Macedonia and Thrace, that the fate of justice in this war had been its fate before, and that it was so elsewhere. Above all, he tells us that harsh things, such as those that happened in the cities during the civil wars, have happened before, and always are going to happen in the future, for as long as the same nature of human beings exists. This uncompromising statement about human nature is Thucydides' clearest echo of his opening promise to reveal the comprehensive and permanent truth about human affairs, and indeed the most obvious lesson of the work as a whole for statesmen and others alike is the sobering one, that as long as our species remains, we must reckon on a human nature that will again and again, when given the chance, overpower the fragile restraints of law and justice. End quote. So the author here really does say that Thucydides' ultimate lesson about human nature is the fragility of justice and the fragility of law. That when it's either the opportunity arises or it becomes feasible, or it becomes potentially necessary, or some pressure pushes from one side or the other, our dedication to justice topples over very easily. Whether it's in the times of the plague, when people think that their lives are going to end soon and therefore they should get what they can quickly, they should satisfy their pleasures now and not think of tomorrow. Justice goes out the window. People just satisfy their own desires and their own passions when given the opportunity, and it seems like consequences are not tied to actions, when it seems like suffering is all around anyway. People will just satisfy their base desires, and their dedication to justice doesn't stand up when push comes to shove, and people who don't take sides get killed. I talked about that civil war in Corcyra in the last episode, and that's what he's referring to there. But again, I don't know how much you can really say that that is a more true human nature. Dedication to law and justice are also a part of human lives everywhere, from then to now. And we keep trying to build societies in which we can get along with one another and live peacefully. And when we get to a point when we are living peacefully in communities, we want to stay there. We want to keep our communities safe. So that's also a part of human nature. And it shouldn't be completely discounted to say that human nature is sort of revealed in these crisis situations. Maybe it's just a different side of human nature. Anyhow, let me move to the next section where he begins to talk about Alcibiades. He says, quote, Thucydides attributes the Athenians' defeat in the war, and at Sicily in particular, to private ambitions for honor and gain, ambitions that were no longer restrained after Pericles' death by the intelligent and public-spirited guidance of the leading citizen. There was no longer the harmony between the leader's private ambitions and the public good that had been characteristic of Athens under Pericles. This analysis reminds one of Nicias' charge in his attempt to dissuade the Athenians from the Sicilian campaign, that his fellow commander Alcibiades was urging it from entirely selfish motives. Now one might say in Alcibiades' defense that his private ambition for honor and wealth from the Sicilian Expedition was in full harmony with the wishes of the Athenian assembly. But one must add that the people's wishes, as expressed in the assembly, were no true measure of the city's interests, and not merely because of their ignorance of those interests. That even the Athenian people subordinated the public good to a kind of private interest becomes evident above all in their savage response to the mutilations of the Hermes statues, which occurred while the departure for Sicily was being prepared. The Athenians believed that these mutilations were an ill omen for the expedition, and also, though it was hardly plausible, that they were done as part of a conspiracy against the people. Some of the Athenians may have believed they deserved to fail in Sicily, or to be conspired against by tyrannical individuals, as punishment for being a tyrannical city. At all events, their morbid fear of oligarchic or tyrannical conspiracies fueled what was, for them, an uncharacteristic passion to avenge offenses against the gods. They arrested many respectable men, and even killed some of them, merely because they had been accused. They even recalled Alcibiades from his command in Sicily to face the capital charge of having profaned the mystery rites. This, too, they claimed in connection with a conspiracy against the people. Now there were reasons to be sure to suspect Alcibiades of having tyrannical ambitions, and he betrayed Athens to Sparta after he had fled from prosecution. Yet he was Athens' most capable general, and his dismissal from the Athenian command, together with the able counsel that he gave to Sparta, led directly to Athens' failure in Sicily. The Athenian people, or more precisely, the class of mostly poor Athenians who called themselves the whole community, were so eager to conquer Sicily that those of their fellow citizens who opposed the campaign were afraid to raise their hands against it. And these Athenians were not deterred from the expedition by what they themselves regarded as an ill omen. Yet these same Athenians cared so little for the army's safety or even the city's survival in the war as compared to their own rule within the city, that they tried to condemn their most capable general to death for an impiety that he may or may not have committed. As for the danger that success in Sicily might help Alcibiades to become a tyrant in the future, this is a risk that the Athenian democracy would have had to accept as a price for conquering Sicily. Moreover, Thucydides indicates in an apparent digression that the earlier Athenian tyrants had practiced virtue and intelligence throughout most of their rule, and that they upheld most of the customary laws, including especially the sacred observances. This behavior is in striking contrast, of course, to that of the populace, who were then in the grip of a foolish partisanship, and whose actions were all the more heedless because they believed, apparently, that their chief concern was for the whole city and for the gods. And in accordance with all this, Thucydides concludes not that it was Alcibiades, but rather the many among the Athenians, each of whom was privately annoyed at his practices, who brought about the city's fall. End quote. He says, talking about Alcibiades is like the best general that the Athenians have, really. They've got a few generals, but Alcibiades is probably the best of them. And he's kind of young and brash. And he argued in favor of the expedition to Sicily, which was a major expedition toward the end of the war. And Nicias had argued against it. And the Athenian people supported it, and they commissioned it, and it was huge, and it left the city really without a very ample defense because they sent so much of their military force to Sicily to conquer it. What seems in retrospect to be a totally terrible decision. It's too far away from Athens. They're in the middle of a war with their next door neighbor, Sparta, and they're sending so much of their military way off to Sicily to help one of their supposed allies, who's not even really that, I don't think, that crucial to Athens' operation or that close of an ally. But they think they could get something out of it. And so they send off the mission, and then they recall Alcibiades before things have even really begun, because they want to accuse him of participating in some desecration of some statues. And I don't think they really had much of a reason to think that he was involved, but for whatever reason they thought he was involved, and they recalled him to put him to trial in the middle of the Sicilian Expedition. So they're left with the general that didn't want to go in the first place, heading up the operation. It's a complete disaster. He says that the Athenians believed that they were acting in the best interest of their city and the gods, and for that reason they were reckless, because they felt that their intentions were good. They were acting on the behalf of the city. They didn't understand what was in their own best interest. And this is, where I think democracy comes apart a little bit, and I think Thucydides is illustrating this point. Number one, they never should have gone on this expedition. Alcibiades was arguing in favor of it because he was a glory seeker. And maybe he would have been able to pull it off if he had been there. He was a very good general, but maybe he wouldn't have. History doesn't tell us that story because he came back. They attempted to bring him back to stand trial, and ultimately he betrayed Athens to Sparta, which didn't help matters for Athens, obviously. But because they feared him becoming a tyrant, they were afraid of Alcibiades, and they valued their democracy so much that they didn't want to let Alcibiades get too powerful. And the author says if they wanted to conquer Sicily, that was just a risk they were going to have to take. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't take out Alcibiades for fear of tyranny and also conquer Sicily. But they wanted to have it both ways. And their fear of tyranny wound up their own downfall. And Thucydides says in an apparent digression that the early Athenian tyrants practiced virtue and intelligence. and they upheld the customary laws, including sacred observances. Whereas the populace is constantly shifting and is unsteady. And ultimately, Thucydides blames the Athenian people. He says Thucydides concludes not that it was Alcibiades, but rather the many among the Athenians, each of whom was privately annoyed at his practices, who brought about the city's fall. The Athenian people brought about the fall of the city. It was not Alcibiades, it was not the generals, it was not any of the leaders, it was the heedless, careless populace voting for bad policies. So now let me talk a little bit about Nicias, the other general. He says, quote, "After Alcibiades' dismissal from Sicily, one of the two remaining Athenian generals was Nicias, a moderate and pious man who had opposed the expedition, but whose loyalty, at any rate, the Athenians believed they could trust. Thucydides shows his own sympathy for Nicias by commenting, on the occasion of his surrender and his death at the hands of the Syracusans, that he deserved least among the Greeks during my time to come to this degree of misfortune because of his full devotion to virtue as established by custom." This remark, however, may surprise some readers, since Thucydides' account has already indicated that Nicias' own weaknesses of character and judgment played a large part in Athens' defeat. Let us look then at some of the ways in which Nicias contributed to Athens' failure, and we will then be in a better position to explain the apparent inconsistency between Thucydides' narrative and his explicit judgment. Nicias' hope against hope to prevent the expedition, which the Athenians had already resolved upon, together with his wish to sail as safely as possible if he were to be compelled to go, led him to advise the Athenians to send a much larger force than they were intending. His tactics failed to prevent the expedition, but he did succeed in convincing the Athenians to send this larger army. Indeed, it was only after his advice had made them confident in the expedition's safety that they fell in love with it. The reluctant Nicias' concern for safety, and for the safety of his reputation as a successful general, was thus directly responsible for the size of the Athenians' stake in Sicily as well as for their enthusiasm. Yet the gravest and most revealing of Nicias' mistakes occurred much later in the campaign, when even with Demosthenes' reinforcements the Athenians failed to capture Syracuse. The ships and their crews were steadily deteriorating, the enemy was gathering strength, and it should have been clear that the Athenians ought to return home at once, while their naval superiority still allowed them to do so. But Nicias was unwilling to return to Athens without orders from home, on the grounds, as he said, that the Athenians, including most of the soldiers who were then clamoring to return, would convict the generals of having been bribed by the enemy. Knowing the natures, he said, of the Athenians, he preferred to risk perishing, if he must, at the hands of his enemies, and privately, rather than to perish on a shameful charge and unjustly at the hands of the Athenians. Nicias had good reason, given the democracy's suspiciousness of its own leaders, to fear banishment and perhaps even death if he had returned home with the army. Yet the fact remains that his choice to die privately in Sicily led directly to the army's ruin and cost the lives of thousands of his troops. One might say, in partial defense of Nicias, that he still believed there was a chance to capture Syracuse, and that when the arrival of fresh enemy troops persuaded him that he had been mistaken, he agreed to lead the army home. But then, when an eclipse of the moon so troubled the majority of the Athenians that they urged or ordered the generals to postpone the departure, Nicias said that he wouldn't even consider deliberating about how to depart until the thrice 9 days prescribed by the soothsayers had passed. For he was somewhat excessively attached, observes Thucydides, to divination and the like. Nicias may well have believed that the fleet's best hopes for safety, and not merely his own, required them to remain at Syracuse for the prescribed period, but it is hard to excuse a general for giving in to such superstitious fears and hopes. Because of this foolish delay, the Athenian army lost its final opportunity to return home safely. After a final naval defeat in their desperate attempt to break out of the Syracusan harbor, the Athenians were so overwhelmed by the greatness of their present evils that it didn't even occur to them, not even to the pious Nicias, to ask for the return of the corpses of their dead comrades. Tearfully, and with much self-reproach, the fleeing Athenians also abandoned their wounded comrades, but the army was nevertheless unable to save itself. In the light of this narrative, we are prepared to notice that when Thucydides says of Nicias that his misfortune was so undeserved, he says that this was because of his devotion to virtue as established by custom, that is to say, conventional virtue, as distinct from virtue simply. Though Nicias's devotion to conventional virtue helped make him a highly decent man, and one whom the Athenians could trust in most ordinary circumstances, both he and also virtue as he understood it were unequal to the extreme test of the Sicilian campaign. Nicias was fully devoted to conventional virtue. At all events, he never willingly did any harm to his fatherland. Yet conventional virtue is an unreliable thing, for it is dependent upon, and in part guided by, hopes that have no other support than the belief in conventional virtue itself. Nicias's devotion to conventional virtue was at the root of his trustful hope that he, or at least his good name, could have the security that the same devotion led him to think he deserved. And yet this blind hope for personal security was largely responsible, we know, for his own death and his city's disaster. End quote. So that's pretty heavy stuff. He kind of blames Nicias in a way for much of the problems of the Sicilian campaign. He didn't really want to go. And one of his tactics to attempt to persuade the city not to go was to offer up the notion that, well, they would need a massive army to do it. So if they're going to send it, they need to send it with a huge number of people, a huge number of fighters, land fighters, to engage in this conflict. They can't just send the navy, in the hopes that this would dissuade the people from doing it. But the Athenians were so enthusiastic, now they felt like they had Nicias' stamp of approval if they do it with a huge army. Now we can get Alcibiades and Nicias on board, and they're sure to win. So the Athenians did it anyway, which made the stakes that much higher when the Athenians lost in Sicily. And also, he blames Nicias not wanting to leave without orders from Athens, because he fears that he'll be tried, executed, or exiled for returning home without orders, for not staying and winning, for cowardice, or whatever they would charge him with. He says, it won't go well for me, basically, if we return home now. So out of his own personal desire to not have to face that sort of an end, he'd rather die in the enemy's sword. That decision to not flee when it became apparent that they weren't going to win cost him, his army, his city, thousands of lives, and perhaps ultimately cost them the war. So, lastly, his dedication to superstition. Thrice 9 days, that's 27 days of sitting in one place. What are they eating? They're eating all of their food. Any food that they have servants that are carrying stuff. Anything that they're carrying, any food they're carrying is getting eaten. They're foraging, I think, trying to find food in nearby. Like, what are you guys doing? They don't want to go because of the eclipse. Thucydides had to overcome the superstition of the soldiers, but instead he gives in to them, and he gives in to the idiotic soothsayers who said, well, we need to sit here for 27 days because of the eclipse of the moon. That was certainly unfortunate coincidence, but the superstition. And so he kind of blames his dedication to conventional virtue, his dedication to Nicias is kind of a conservative. His conservatism, his wanting to do things sort of by the book, doesn't want to innovate. It wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough for the Sicilian campaign. They needed Alcibiades. They needed someone who was bold to be able to pull that off. Nicias was not able to do it. He didn't want to do it in the first place because he knew that he wouldn't be capable of doing it. It wasn't the sort of thing that could be done according to the ways of Nicias. Maybe Alcibiades could have done it, maybe not, but we'll never know. So the last section I want to read is just the overview of the Sicilian campaign. He says, quote, "The Sicilian campaign was a grave mistake. Athens' prospects for success, or even for the army's safe return, were dependent on its power to reconcile private and public interest, and yet the expedition stretched the city too far beyond the limits of this power. Admittedly, the Athenians might have succeeded in Sicily if they had had better luck, for instance, if there had been no mutilation of the Hermes statues, but the attempt was nevertheless immoderate and unwise. And more importantly, the tremendous costs of the expedition, along with the disharmony within the city that brought it so clearly to light, may help us toward a more sober view of Athenian imperialism altogether. For had we not ourselves been deceived by the charm that deceived the Athenians, we might already have seen that their imperialism was flawed from the beginning by a fundamental lack of wisdom. The Athenians, and the best among their leaders, devoted themselves to building a great and noble empire. Since, however, they thought of themselves as being noble, they could not help feeling the weight of the accusations against them for presuming to rule over others against their will. Accordingly, they felt obliged to defend their empire against these accusations, and they did so by arguing that they, like all men, were compelled by nature to be selfish, to put their own good before all other considerations. On the other hand, since they thought of their empire and of themselves as being noble, they accepted certain risks and hardships in connection with their rule that would seem to have been at odds with their own self-interest. Now, it must have troubled them to do this, for in view of their own argument for empire, these additional risks and hardships would appear to have been senseless sacrifices. But the Athenians apparently regarded them less as sacrifices than as a price worth paying, on the ground that all their sufferings in connection with the pursuit of empire would be more than compensated for by the reward of everlasting glory. Yet in this thought they were mistaken. For what they experienced with regard to glory, or with regard to the prospect of it in the future, was colored by their belief that glory was not merely a good, but also something noble, that is to say, an acknowledgement of their superiority to mere self-interest and of their willingness on occasion to sacrifice. In other words, they had not squarely faced their own argument in defense of empire, for this argument leaves no room for superiority to self-interest, or anything more important than one's own good. And had they truly accepted this argument, they would not have been moved, or not in the same way, by the prospect of glory. And they would hardly have felt that their sufferings in its pursuit would be so sufficiently and lastingly repaid. Long before the disaster in Sicily, then, the Athenians and their best leaders were already led astray by their failure to understand themselves and the object of their longing." End quote. So that's a little hard to really understand what he's saying here in this kind of summing up. But he says that basically the Athenian imperialism was flawed from the beginning by a fundamental lack of wisdom. He said they devoted themselves to building a great and noble empire, but they thought of themselves as noble. So they attempted to, he says they could not help feeling the weight of the accusations against them for presuming to rule over others against their will. So in order to, they felt obligated to justify their empire. They felt obliged to defend their empire against these accusations, and they did so by arguing that they, like all men, were compelled by nature to be selfish. So they feel like they have to justify themselves for having this empire and ruling over other people. And they justify themselves by saying we're compelled by nature to be selfish and to put our own good first. It's an argument of deterministic necessity. This is the way of the world, and We're all in the conflict of all against all, right? At the level of polis against polis. There are all these groups, these different tribes, these clans, these cities. They're all in competition with one another, and they all have to have the motivation to strike first. And so the Athenians are simply following the course of nature to expand themselves and strengthen themselves, and the empire is the result. But they're still bound to believing that their empire is noble, and they're trying to glorify themselves and their empire in a way that overextends itself. It doesn't put self-interest first. They begin to put glory first, because they have this conflict between their attempt to justify their empire through self-interest and their attempt to also justify their empire through glory and nobility and these sort of the virtuous empire that they want to be. So that will do it for that. Thanks a lot for listening. Goodbye.